Hi everyone, just want to show you some HDR work, but more importantly a little bit of dodging and burning with a difference this time, working on some dodging and burning just using the Radial tool. This was shot on a workshop a couple of weeks ago. It was a very grey day. It was actually more like this shot here, and very much white cloud, but there was a little bit of detail there. Usually HDR works really well when you've got a huge tonal range to contend with, certainly bright sunny days, but I thought I'd do a demonstration on this, and more importantly a bit of dodging and burning, as I said, using the Radial tool. This was the end result. So I actually did this one in Adobe Camera Raw, and it's very much the same process, but we're going to try and do something fairly similar and working in Lightroom this time. So for HDR, you set the camera to bracket. You can use HDR if your camera has it, but throw away the HDR image that the camera does, because usually that's not very good. And the whole idea of HDR is to have more tonal range for dodging and burning, not just for a flat image that comes straight out of the camera or just what HDR generally does. It is about extending the tonal range and using that for dodging and burning. And go with initially a medium exposure image, so something in the middle there. Then you can either manually, if you're working on a tripod, or if you're careful, handheld, expose one for the highlights and one for the shadows. You can set this up if you wish, like I say, using bracketing, but just make sure that the bracketing is doing the correct thing with the extremes of the exposure. So this one was shot for the shadow detail, so lighter, and on the other side here, this one was shot for the highlights, to make sure, particularly down here, we've not lost anything at all there. So we're going to get some sort of result similar to this at the end. So for HDR, it's the same in Photoshop, and also more or less the same if you use Affinity Photo. Make sure you select all three images here, so select the first one, hold shift down, select the third one, and they will all be selected. Just show you that again, select the first one, shift, hold the third, all three are selected. You can just right click, go to Photo Merge, HDR. Now Lightroom will just do its thing, usually takes a few seconds. What you want to make sure is that Auto Align is on, Auto Settings, just to come in as it is to see what it does. So that is useful to have that on, particularly if you're not used to this. If you've worked handheld, then make sure you've got the deghost on, and you can play around with low, medium or high. And that's what these red blotches are. It's just showing where there's a little bit of ghosting, which isn't a problem when it's clouds. So just keep an eye on that. Let's show you a medium one, see how that does. I'm not too worried on this. I think we will go with a medium one. That's the show overlay, just so you can see that, and we don't need to create a stack. So Auto Align, Auto Settings. If you're shot on a tripod and nothing's moved, none, but play around with the deghosting if you need to. Then I click on Merge, and what happens next is that all that will be merged together, and Lightroom will produce a DNG file, so a digital negative, which means there's going to be a lot more tonal range. That's the DNG come in. Now what's important to realise is that normally in the exposure slider this goes to 5 each side. We've now got double the exposure range, so this is where the HDR comes into play. Okay, I'm going to turn this to black and white, but you can work in colour if you wish first and turn it to black and white at the end. I know I want this as a black and white image. Let's sort out the verticals. We'll try auto, which isn't too bad. We can look at just changing this a little bit if we need to. So just changing that vertical just a tiny bit there. Move those edges in. And just bring that sky down a little bit as well there. I think a little less water as well. And we're ready to go with the dodging and burning. So I do want this quite dark and contrasty, so first of all let's just pull the exposure down and pop the contrast up. Just adjust the exposure a little bit more there. So that's my overall base, just a little bit bright over here, so I'm just going to go over to the radial filter. Bring that exposure down a little bit. As you can see, that's too dark, so we're just going to pull that back a little bit. Around about there will be fine. Okay, let's take a look at the shard here. So I'm going to pull out a very, very tall and thin radial filter just to put some light in. Just come down to the edge and it turns to double arrows, and you can just twist that. Twist that a little bit more. We've got invert on here. It's showing negative exposure, so we're going to push that up and just put a little highlight in there. Make the feather where you think you need it. We're going to pull it all the way up, that feathering. It makes quite a soft highlight there. Again, playing around with exposure a little bit. That works fairly well. You come over to this black marker here, and we can right click and duplicate it, and then drag it over, spin it round a little bit, make this one a little bit thinner. Push that up a little bit there. I think this one we're going to pull down a little bit as well. Maybe to about there. I'm going to duplicate this one again by right clicking. I'm just going to extend this one on the left here, just down a bit further. And maybe just dial that back a little bit. Duplicate again. Just pop that up to the top there. And we can carry on duplicating really, rather than keep drawing new ones out. So we're going to come down to the text here, just spin that round. Duplicate that again. Just pop a little bit of light down here. And pop some light just into the water here as well. Can pull that right off the edges. Just to open up that shoreline. Same with these buildings here. If you want to do anything with those, let's pull this one here, duplicate. Try not to draw the edges when you move it like I did there. So we can straighten that up a little bit. Put the light where you want it. Duplicate again. And we'll put a little bit of light in there. And duplicate that one as well. Maybe just along the edge there. If you can't get in and grab the actual marker, then just zoom in, pull it over. Let's just try that. I think it's going to look quite nice there. Let's turn that off just to see how that looks. Zoom out so we can just assess it. And maybe just one more over here. Just feed some light in there. Just watch these edges don't spill over where you don't need them. And don't forget, you can always come back and change the feathering properties as well. Just see how that looked. Yeah, I think a little bit brighter light that works. Let's turn that off. And go back now as we've turned everything off and just fine tune that exposure, see how that looks. I'm going to put a little bit of a tone curve on just to work on those blacks a little bit more without affecting the highlights too much. And that's starting to pop really there. Sometimes you need to watch some of these brighter areas. They can look a little bit unnatural, but be careful with that. If you need to go back and maybe say this one here is a little bit on the bright side or maybe in the wrong place, dial that back a little bit, move it over. I do quite like the way these windows here are being kicked up with those highlights, so we'll leave that as it is. And that really kind of like does change the whole feel of those buildings there. We can still look at the sky as well, so we could look at just really some regular dodging and burning on that. Just select the adjustment brush, get the exposure somewhere you need to be, so we're not going to need a lot of negative exposure. Make sure you're on a full feather of 100. Use the bracket keys for your brush size. I generally use a very large brush, and just darken things down a little bit in that sky. Check your exposure again. If you need to erase anything, click on the eraser. You can always hover over this marker here as well, and that will bring the quick mask up. So if you feel you've gone over a little bit too much here, just take that back a little bit. The other option, rather than using a brush, if you want to, it's not always my favourite, and be careful with it. If we just delete that by clicking on that marker, you could always look at putting a very, very faint vignette in there. So let's just finish with that. So turn the adjustment brush off, go down to effects. The way I do my vignettes, if you've not seen before in other videos, I put a full amount in, put the feather all the way up to 100, check on the roundness, so we've got an upright rectangle, so we don't want a circle. We'll keep it around about like that, and check where you want that midpoint. I generally like a midpoint in quite a lot with 100% feather. And then all we do, we dial it back so we can't really see the edges and the effect. Just want it to be very, very delicate. If it looks like that, it's too much, unless you like it like that yourself, okay? So just dial it back. It's almost just like a faint burning in of the edges. So like -22 is the maximum really. So there you go. If we look at the original, so that was the mid-tone shot that you may well have shot without doing HDR, and from there we've gone to the finished image here. Let's compare that to my original in Photoshop just for fun. Yeah, maybe a little bit harder on the contrast there, so you know, we can always go back and say, well, let's maybe just dial that contrast back a little bit more, unless you want to keep that really, really high. Even checking that tone curve as well. So as always, plenty of options just to go back and change anything you've done there.